Before and during World War II, the armies involved developed a series of self-loading rifles. Bolt-action rifles had become obsolete technology. Only the Americans succeeded in arming every single soldier with a self-loading weapon, obviously with the famous M1 Garand, but the ones who came closest after them were the Soviets with the SVT-40. Hello, I'm Vlad Sparastoria. I shoot, and that's all I know how to do. On one hand, the Red Army of the 1940s might seem like a rough, crude force that relies on numbers and simplicity, but that's not always the case. In fact, the Soviet army, perhaps also free from many preconceptions, often looked for very original solutions, so much so that they were among the very first to use a self-loading weapon. This series of self-loading rifles would eventually lead to the SVT-40 shown here, which, however, would be a weapon that had problems throughout its entire service life. It had many positive aspects, but also some negative ones, given its troubled history, the story of its development, and the story of its production. So let's go to the studio to take a closer look at what we have in our hands, to understand why the SVT is the way it is. Then, of course, we'll take a closer look, disassemble it, and obviously, we absolutely have to test fire it. How do you begin telling the story of such an iconic weapon? Start at the beginning. The beginning, as always, like in so many of these stories I tell you, is 1886 when, repeat it with me, the French introduced the Lebel rifle. The Lebel rifle, equipped with a new smokeless powder cartridge, would allow for a huge technological leap forward. Smokeless powder would actually make self-loading weapons possible, burning much cleaner and much more consistently, and with it, the first machine guns would be born. And if many different machine guns would be developed, they would be developed relatively quickly. A series of self-loading pistols, but to have truly effective self-loading infantry rifles, we will have to wait longer. There will generally be two reasons for this. The first is purely technical. In the machine gun, we use a full power cartridge, but we have plenty of weight and material to make it work. Pistols, yes, they are light, but the pressures and energies they have to contain are much lower. The infantry rifle must use a full power cartridge while keeping its weight down, while still remaining robust and reliable. It's a weapon system that everywhere in the world will require much more effort and research from gunsmiths and companies to find an efficient solution. Think, for example, of the case of the French Lebel. It had an innovative cartridge, yes, but since it was adopted in a hurry and was a new technology, it was less than ideal. The Russians, at the beginning of the 20th century, would purchase a series of Maxim machine guns, which they would use in the war against Japan between 1904 and 1905. A war that, as is well known, would be won by Japan. A war that would be, tactically speaking, something of a prelude to the First World War. It would indeed see large maneuvers in the old style, but also an extensive use of field fortifications such as trenches and in fact tactics where the machine gun was used. And after this war, there would be many Russian gunsmiths who would try to develop a self-loading weapon. Fedorov, Tokarev, and of course, our Tokarev. However, despite the experience of the Russo-Japanese War, the tactical innovations were not understood by the Russian High Command. One very particular episode is especially significant. On February 21, 1912, Tsar Nikolai II attended a lecture by Fedorov. Fyodorov, who was a military officer and also a professor at the Infantry Officers' School in Oranienbaum. At that time, Fyodorov had already built a series of prototypes of what would eventually become the famous Fyodorov 1916, which some consider to be the first assault rifle. I wouldn't make that comparison, but that's a story for another day. During a break, the Tsar asked Fyodorov if he was the one who invented this self-loading rifle. "Exactly, it was me, Your Majesty," replied Colonel Fyodorov. "I am definitely against its use in the army," said the Tsar. A bit embarrassed, Fyodorov replied, "Your Majesty, may I ask why?" And the Tsar's answer is perfectly emblematic of the military thinking of the time, because there wouldn't be enough ammunition. This answer seems almost ridiculous to us, this very old-fashioned way of thinking. However, there are some very serious considerations to be made. Yes, in the more industrialized areas of Europe and the world, railways were spreading. However, many military operations, such as those carried out by Russia against Japan, took place in relatively remote locations. And in remote locations, ammunition had to be carried by hand or on the back of a mule or horse. We've already seen this reluctance to waste ammunition and to use systems that allow for the waste of ammunition. Some cases are significant. The first example that comes to mind is in America, where the American cavalry, which is quite unique in the world, went from being equipped with a repeating carbine, the Spencer 1860, to a single-shot rifle, giving up the repeating system. Another example we can mention is that of the Italians who, when adopting the Swiss Vetterli, which was originally designed as a repeating weapon, removed the entire loading system and adopted it as a single-shot weapon. About 10 years later, they realized their mistake and put a magazine back on it. But there are many examples we can give of how reluctant the European powers were to adopt even just a magazine. We're not talking about a self-loading weapon, which in their eyes would have allowed poorly trained and often illiterate soldiers to waste ammunition. Obviously this, like the rest we've seen on the channel, will change quite rapidly when the Russians and the Turks clashed during the siege of Plevna in 1877-1880. Even though the Russians will win this siege, the Turks will demonstrate the power of repeating firearms. From that moment on, the magazine and the repeating system will be accepted, but for the self-loading weapon, we will still have to wait. Keeping this context in mind, let's finally introduce the hero of our story. Fedor Vasilievich Tokarev was born in 1871 in a village in the Rostov region to a Cossack family. He received little primary education at the parish school. However, in 1885 he ended up in a technical institute in that area. At the technical institute, thanks to his talent, he was fortunate enough to study with a fairly important gunsmith. This gunsmith, a certain Chernolikov, had worked at the Tula arsenal and in particular was responsible for a rifle project that is very rare for collectors today. This is the 1860 model rifle for the Cossacks, often known among collectors as the Chernolikov rifle. A muzzle-loading rifle that seems a bit strange to us because of the peculiar shape of the hammer, but also because of the unusual trigger. With this first-hand technical training, in 1891 he graduated and was sent as an armorer to a Cossack regiment. Despite having little primary education, he was a very intelligent person, and in 1900 he managed to graduate as an officer. And in 1907 he would finish at the Oranienbaum Infantry School. Oranienbaum was the place where Russia's greatest military talents ended up. It was indeed an infantry officer school, but it was also an experimental and testing center. And right in 1907, so right after the aforementioned Russo-Japanese War, he built his first self-loading rifle, which was nothing more than a conversion with a blowback system of a regular Moshin Nagant. Because this project showed promise, it was sent to the Sestroretsk arms factory, which is well known. While Izhevsk is also notable, Sestroretsk has its own arms factories, where he stayed from 1908 until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Continuing to work on his ideas for the self-loading weapon. With the start of the First World War, he was called up to fight, but after a year and a half without much action, he returned to the arms factory. However, as we said, Imperial Russia was not a very fertile ground for these inventions. Only Fyodorov would manage to build his famous Fyodorov Avtomat, although in very limited numbers and almost as an experiment. Tokarev, like many other inventors, would have to wait until the end of the revolution and the civil war in Russia. Russia, now turned into the Soviet Union, offered new opportunities for these people. Also because the High Command, less conservative than the old Tsarist commanders, allowed space for these innovations, which were not only a way to spread the revolution, but also a way to show the whole world how modern the Soviet Union was. In 1925, Tokarev built a machine gun, a modification of the Maxim machine gun, which is why it is known as the Maxim. Tokarev, which is officially adopted by the Soviet Army, is the first great success of our inventor. This machine gun will be produced in a few thousand units, but it will not be particularly successful. Most of the Maxims by Tokarev will end up either in China, given as aid during the Civil War, or also in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, of course. In fact, this machine gun will be replaced just 2 years later by the much better DP-27 by Degtyarev, a weapon we were lucky enough to see many years ago on the channel. Tokarev will continue his work on self-loading weapons. In 1927, believe it or not, he will create what is essentially a submachine gun. However, keep in mind that at this time, Russia still doesn't produce pistol ammunition because it doesn't have a self-loading pistol. To make this submachine gun, Tokarev will even use the Nagant revolver cartridge. It will all remain at the experimental stage. Obviously, as we just said, Tokarev's great success after this experiment will be the adoption of the TT-30 and then the TT-33. The Tula Tokarev pistol will be the standard semi-automatic sidearm of the Soviet Union during World War II and in the following years. He had made a machine gun, he had made a submachine gun, he had made a pistol, perhaps his greatest success. His first design, a semi-automatic rifle, was missing from this collection. The most difficult project of all. Even before, along with the development of what was supposed to be the light machine gun, the one that would become the Maxim Tokarev. And on the other hand, because still within the same project, the same program, work was beginning on Degtyarev's DP-27 and on the self-loading rifle. Great and lesser-known names of Russian weapons engineering took part in this program in the 1920s. Little-known names like Kolesnikov and Konovalov, and great names like the already mentioned Fedorov, Degtyarev and Tokarev. The designers were tasked with creating a rifle that weighed less than 4 kg, was self-loading and selective fire, and used the standard cartridge of 7 and 7.62. The development of these prototypes was completed in 1925, and the following year, in 1926, the first tests for the adoption of a new weapon were carried out. Fyodorov and Tokarev would present short recoil rifles, also because these were projects they were already working on. Degtyarev, on the other hand, would work on a gas-operated rifle. The commission was impressed, however, the rifles were judged to be insufficient. Some advice was given and other requirements were established, such as the bayonet. In addition, another thing the commission noticed was the problem with the caliber. The 7.62 by 54R cartridge, in fact, is not very suitable for self-loading weapons. The Fedorov automat we already mentioned, in fact, is chambered in 6.5 Arisaka. The protruding rim of the cartridge and its high power actually caused problems for self-loading weapons. And even though Russia and the former satellite states still use this caliber today, Russia and the Soviet Union have made several attempts to replace it. A note from the 1928 Commission actually says that new ammunition should be tested in a caliber of 2.5 lines, that is 5.45. When in the 1970s the K-74 used a bullet of exactly that diameter, it was no coincidence, because a series of experiments had already been carried out on that size. And the ammunition designers would partially revisit that work. In hindsight, we know how it turned out. This recommendation was taken into consideration. However, the logistical needs of the gigantic Soviet army prevailed. The work would continue on the 7.62 X-54. The second competition for these weapons, which were revised and modified, took place in June 1928. Alongside the usual greats Fedorov, Degtyarev, Tokarev, we see many other names. Urasnov, Kuznetsov, and a very interesting note, a rather forgotten inventor, a certain Roshchov, a gunsmith who had very little luck, who worked and would work for decades on a delayed blowback system. And even though none of his weapons were ever adopted, various authors, such as Obolotin, a very famous author on Soviet weapons, regard him as one of the fathers of firearms experimentation in the Soviet Union. The second competitive test failed. None of the weapons were satisfactory. By 1930, there would be a third competitive test. Once again, many inventors would show up, and once again the weapons would be basically unsatisfactory. Between April 4th and 6th, 1930, the Commission, in a meeting with the inventors, began an important discussion that would shape the future of this program. Despite some very interesting projects, the Commission came to the conclusion that now in 1930 they are stuck, they've remained at 1960. No progress has been made. And to make progress, it was necessary to better define the requirements. There are 7 main requirements, and many of these details, and this is the important part, will reappear in the SVT-40. The first is obviously to keep the existing caliber, the 7.62 or 7.62 X54R. The second requirement is that the weight had to be a maximum of 4 kilograms. The third requirement concerned the magazine. It could be removable, double stack, with 10 or 15 rounds, or a fixed internal magazine with 5 or 10 rounds. The fourth requirement concerned the safety mechanisms. The weapon had to be perfectly mechanically safe when there was a round in the chamber. The fifth requirement dictated a muzzle brake to control muzzle rise and recoil of the weapon, and a rate reducer, since remember at this point that these are all selective fire weapons. Now, I don't know how many of you have fired full power rounds on full auto, but the weapons are not particularly controllable. The sixth requirement, which was very important at the time but seems a bit ridiculous to us now, the essential ability to mount a bayonet. The seventh, vague but important requirement was maximum simplicity of construction and use. However, in 1930, there was another very important turning point. The Soviets were watching very closely what the Americans were doing overseas. The Americans had been engaged for years in a series of very rigorous experiments for the adoption of a self-loading weapon. We have told this story well when talking about the M1 Garand, and few nations have ever tested their equipment as thoroughly as the Americans. From observing the American tests, another very important requirement relevant to our story was added. The weapons would have to be gas-operated, not with a moving barrel. So, in 1930, a bit of a clean sweep was made. Many of the systems that Tokarev himself had designed had to be completely discarded. The Tokarev rifle he had presented up to this point, remember, was with a recoiling barrel, not gas-operated. And 1930 would also be the year when the decision was made to put the Mosin back into production, precisely because the self-loading rifle program was delayed. So, having basically reset it, it still wasn't ready as a finished rifle. It's no coincidence that the Mosin also has a much more interesting history. Influenced by this failure, by this reset in the self-loading rifle program, there was an opportunity to have some rifles. So the Mosin is put back into production, and in this context, a new design will emerge. A design and an inventor younger than the others mentioned. An inventor whose 1926 rifle went unnoticed because it was still not perfect, but the new one from 1931 would make a big impression on the Soviet Commission. The name of this new young star, who at the time was just over 30 years old, was Sergei Simonov. Simonov's rifle really impressed the Soviet Commission. It impressed them so much, and an improved version in 1934 impressed them so much that they decided to put it into pre-production and make an experimental batch to give to the troops. Tokarev isn't idle either. He will create a very simple gas system, which we will get to because it's a very interesting part of this story, and he will also change some details of how the weapon operates. Where he previously used a rotating bolt, he will switch to a tilting bolt, which is definitely simpler. He's kind of copying what Simonov was doing. In the end, for the Soviets to choose from, there were only these two weapons, which had emerged as the best. The new rifle by Tokarev, gas-operated with a tilting bolt, and Simonov's rifle. Very rigorous tests were carried out. The weapons were disassembled into all their parts, analyzed, studied, tried, and tested. The test of 1935 and 1937 would have a winner, Simonov, whose selective fire rifle was adopted as the AVS-36 in that very year. About 65,000 of them were produced in total. However, it was not perfect. Like many self-loading weapons, at the beginning of production it suffered from many small issues. The first use was during the war between Finland and the Soviet Union, where the Soviets, for example, complained about its reliability in low temperatures, while the Finns were very impressed by the firepower of the Simonov. The start of production would prove to be difficult, and Simonov, together with his team, would never be able to completely solve the weapon's problems. Problems that, it should be noted, he mainly attributed to the ammunition used and its protruding rim. It was a significant issue. On May 22, 1938, the People's Commissar of Defense announced a new competition for a new self-loading rifle. The new systems were presented, and the systems of Tokarev, Simonov, the one already existing, and a certain Rukashnikov were compared. The results of the test showed that none of the rifles were actually fully satisfactory. Rukashnikov was completely discarded. Simonov's rifle was simpler to produce, less expensive to manufacture, and had fewer parts, but Tokarev's, despite its greater weight, proved to be more reliable. Or maybe because of the greater weight, so the components were a bit thicker. And furthermore, compared to Simonov's rifle, Tokarev's rifle had a huge advantage, an advantage that we absolutely cannot underestimate in this story. Stalin liked it. So in 1938, it was adopted as the SVT-38. The SVT-38 and the AV-38, its selective fire version, also have a whole series of problems. Problems that are more or less corrected in the version that was supposed to be the definitive one, the SVT-40. It was a rushed adoption, and you really shouldn't underestimate Stalin's influence. Stalin, who was very fascinated and obsessed with self-loading rifles, wanted everyone to be armed with a self-loading rifle. These plans, of course, were interrupted by the German invasion in 1941. They needed to produce a lot of rifles, and they needed to produce them now. And an SVT-40 cost 5 times as much as a Mosin. Production was quickly slowed down until it stopped completely, to make room for weapons like the Mosin and submachine guns. And then, around 45, with the return of good old Simonov and his very famous SKS-45, another iconic weapon that we've seen a lot on the channel, the SVT-40 rifles throughout their entire service life would be plagued by problems. I like to compare the SVT-40 with the Garand because the Garand is the other famous semi-automatic rifle of World War II. The Garand is a complete package. By the time it reaches the battlefield, most of its problems have been diagnosed and corrected. As a result, the Garand would have a very long service life. It won't be the same for the SVT-40, which in its short life will be plagued by problems. There is one thing the SVT-40 will get right in a poetic way: the gas system. This gas system, created after 1930 following the adoption of gas operation, will prove to be extremely simple and reliable. It would first be adopted by the Germans for their Gewehr 43 and then by the rest of the world. If you take most of the weapons that use a short-stroke piston, like the Italian ARX, which is currently used by the Italian army, and disassemble it, you'll notice that the gas system is extremely similar to that of the SVT-40. This is the great legacy of this weapon. In itself, it wasn't a great success, but it was a milestone for this particular component. Actually, you know what? Since we're talking about it, it's finally time to move the camera and take a closer look. And here we are taking a close look at this wonderful SVD, which, as you can see, is very long and
it doesn't fit. It doesn't well in the frame, even though the camera is pretty far away
from the weapon itself. Let's start our tour, as always, with the markings on the weapon. This was produced in 1943, so it's a very late production model, when in those years, very little was actually being produced and they were assembling from already made parts to really avoid wasting anything. Also because in 1942 large-scale production stopped, I repeat. It would continue until 1945, but with only a few units for each year. So even the small ones, in small details, this is a receiver, a weapon of the latest type, since there have been relatively many changes. So this weapon has all the features of late production SVTs. Also because in many small details, in some of the machining on the receiver and the compensator, some small things have changed, which today really fascinate the various collectors of these weapons. Near the muzzle of the weapon, we first have a compensator. As you can see, this compensator has a series of 6 cuts on each side that help stabilize the weapon. By the way, we'll see this during the live fire test. But thanks to the good gas system and this compensator, the rifle has surprisingly little recoil, or at least much less than a Mosin in the same caliber. Then we have a very Soviet-style front sight protected by this piece of perforated sheet metal on top, so you can insert a tool inside to adjust it for elevation and zero the weapon. By the way, this is a design that will be carried forward a lot in Soviet weapons. Under this piece, or rather two pieces of sheet metal, we have the gas system hidden. These two parts are perforated for better ventilation, obviously to cool everything down. Under here, the weapon also has a cleaning rod for the weapon itself, and of course the bayonet mount. The bayonet can be fixed, and we'll see it a bit better during the live fire test. By pressing the button on the bayonet here on the other side, as you can see, it can be removed. Here it is. Going further back, the handguard has more ventilation holes, which makes sense because with the volume of fire from semi-automatic weapons, more ventilation is needed. Moving back, we find a notch here in the wood to place your hand. We'll talk about it a bit more during the live fire test, but in my opinion, ergonomically speaking, the big flaw of this rifle is that it's terribly front heavy. Then we have an adjustable rear sight that can be set for elevation up to 1,500 meters, which is very reminiscent of those on the Mosin, the bolt-action Mosin rifles. The charging handle, which operates the bolt carrier, is quite prominent. Moving back to the controls of the weapon, we then find the magazine release itself, which is quite bulky but can be moved out of the way to protect it a bit. Or if we only have one magazine, we have to load the weapon with stripper clips, but we can still activate it, like on the AKs, and remove the magazine after 10 rounds. Then we have a trigger. You can see a little better from this side the safety of the weapon, which simply physically blocks the trigger from being pressed. Very simple, very easy and cheap to build, and despite this, these weapons, as I mentioned, cost 5 times more than the Mosin. Going back, the stock, which has a reinforcement screw for the action, again shows the serial number and ends with a steel butt plate, just so it can also be used as a club. But the truly interesting part of the SVT, the SVT-40 as we said, is its gas system. We have to reach it by disassembling a whole series of parts. Now I want to say something. This disassembly may seem relatively complicated at times. Before the live fire session, this weapon had a little problem with the gas system and needed some tuning. Let's say I've disassembled and reassembled guns that are a bit less full of interlocking parts than this one. This is all assembled with interlocking parts, as Soviet weapons often are. But you constantly have to fight against the springs. So first of all, we make sure the weapon is unloaded and we have to cock the hammer if it's not already cocked, otherwise it gets in the way and doesn't want to cooperate. Now we can proceed. As you can see, there's the top cover that blocks the spring. We have to do something a bit unusual because we need to remove the top cover. The problem is that half the time during this operation, the spring will be launched right into your line of fire. So I'll try to do it by covering the camera as little as possible, but also making sure that no parts go flying. Hopefully. Oh, does it look easy to you? Wait, no, I have to do it myself. I don't have to, because I need to coordinate myself. Here we go. Leave your hand there. Take your hand away. Take your hand away. Here we go. I get it now, yes, because there's all the tension from the spring, which, by the way, isn't held by anything. Here, and half the time during this maneuver, it gets shot into oblivion. We can now go ahead and remove the spring itself, which, mind you, is under tension again. Here it is. Is it really like that? All just snapped together? What do you think? Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to hear the curses of the guy who had to do this. By the way, 2 springs with 2 separate ones here from the spring. I would also like to know why. I would also like to know the reason. Finally, we can now remove the bolt carrier along with the bolt itself. Let's also separate the bolt from the bolt carrier. Now let's take a look here at the system. We have an extremely simple bolt carrier from this point of view. Here we see where the rifle's short stroke piston uprod acts. We see 2 large windows that regulate the movement of the bolt itself. Otherwise, as you can see, there is literally nothing on this bolt carrier. The bolt looks almost small for the caliber of the ammunition, but I assure you that it is absolutely sufficient. We can see the firing pin and the large extractor that grabs the rims of the cartridges. These two extensions are the ones controlled by the bolt carrier, which moves back and forth. At the end of its travel, in this position we are unlocked, at the end of its travel. It keeps moving forward and pushes the bolt downward. When the system gets gas and the bolt carrier moves back, it pulls up the bolt, which in turn has a locking surface back here. We know this weapon very well also because we know the SKS. Simon Simonov was one of those who worked on it, apart from Tokarev. It was a very simple and well-tested system, but if we put the bolt in, we can see exactly how it locks. As you can see here against this surface, it is locked and doesn't want to move. It has to be lifted by the bolt carrier in order to cycle. When it moves forward again, it goes back into its locked position, staying locked like that. It's a very simple and intuitive system. The bolt carrier is moved by the operating rod that comes out from here. And now we'll get to exactly how you do this to access the gas system. First, we remove the cleaning rod, otherwise it will get in the way. Then we need to press this button connected to this flat spring. To remove the band, we need to remove the band to get to the gas system. We remove the band, which is a bit tough. Here we are. Here we go. With the band removed, we can take off the metal sheet. Here there's a bit of cloth put in by the previous owner of this weapon to keep everything in place a bit better. We can also go ahead and remove the wood, the handguard, and what do we have here? We have a small gas port connected to a little piston. A piston that in turn makes a short stroke but moves this whole operating rod. This charging handle rod, I repeat. If you have an SKS, the system is practically identical, but not only that. Especially those of you who are a bit more knowledgeable about how different firearms work. Notice the similarity with certain AR-18 pistons and their derivatives, even piston-driven ARs, piston-driven AR-15S, all these things. Here, a small piston, now we'll get to it, that moves a long operating rod which, in this case as well, has its own return spring to push it forward again. Obviously from here it pushes on the bolt carrier which will complete the cycle. Let's remove it. To remove it, pull it back, push it up. There's a little clamp in the way, sorry. Here it is. Let's take it out. We have a very simple off-road with its spring. This element goes inside the off-road and hides the gas piston. Look at this weapon and tell me that we don't find this system in many different modern weapons, and not only those. The great legacy of the SWT is precisely this gas system, this short-stroke piston system. There's a debate on the web, especially about who really invented this system. Not just which Soviet, but who in the world. There was the case of Carbine Williams, one of the designers behind the American M1 carbine, who independently developed a similar system, which we would also call a short-stroke piston system. And he developed it independently from the SWT. He didn't know about this thing. However, modern short-stroke systems resemble the SWT much more than the system of the M1 carbine. The gas system here is adjustable, by the way. We had to do it to perform the live fire test of the weapon. You can do it, but we're not doing it now because you need a tool. Unscrew this extension of the gas piston here and rotate this small element, which contains holes of various sizes. It's not a quick adjustment in any way because you need to disassemble up to here and you need a tool, but it's still adjustable, so take note of this. These are weapons that, if properly adjusted, shoot very smoothly. This is a really nice feature, thanks to the rendering power of World of Guns. Let's take a closer look at how the various components of the weapon work. So let's observe again how the gas piston works. Let's remove the hidden parts. The gas will pass through its port to push on the piston. which in turn will push the up rod. As you can see, this movement is very short. Let's watch it again. Notice that it's only a push of about 1.5 centimeters. On the other side, the up rod itself with its return spring pushes against the face of the bolt carrier. The bolt will receive from this small movement the push it needs to continue its cycle. It's also interesting for us to take a look at the trigger mechanism, since the trigger mechanism is adapted for an automatic weapon, in particular because it features a so-called auto sear. Let's see exactly how it works. I have a series of components that connect to the trigger mechanism. This is the hammer. This is an extension of the hammer, which is its spring, and this right here is actually the sear. Then we have a trigger transfer bar, which is very important for the disconnector mechanism, so to ensure single fire, and the trigger itself. When I pull the trigger, I will move the transfer bar forward, which in turn will move the sear forward, whose upper part will go back, releasing the hammer. Now a whole series of things will happen. First of all, let's focus on the disconnector system. Again, I pull the trigger, the bar moves forward, which makes the sear itself oscillate. Do you see the extension of the hammer? Once the hammer moves forward, it slides past this hump on the transfer bar and coming back with the recoil. So that doesn't cock it. And when it goes to recock, the hammer will push the transfer bar itself down. So even with the trigger pulled, since it's pushed down, it's out of contact with the sear itself. To reset the shot, I will necessarily have to release the trigger, resetting the mechanism. Now, by pulling the trigger, I can push the transfer bar forward, which in turn will release the sear. And the whole cycle repeats. Now let's look at another important detail that reveals that this weapon, in some of its other versions, like the SVT-40, can be automatic. This mechanism is also known in Italian as consenso a raffica, and in English it's known as auto sear. How does it work? I have a secondary sear and an element that presses on it. When the hammer strikes the primer and the weapon recoils, it will push down on this element. And we see that with the pressure of this element, the secondary sear engages the hammer. Now, at this moment, even if the trigger hadn't reset as we just saw, because it's an automatic weapon, the hammer would have been held until, as the bolt closes, the auto sear releases, allowing the hammer at this moment to go forward again as one element moves out of the way. A very important element for safety during automatic fire, it prevents the weapon from firing until the bolt is closed. Now that we've seen how to disassemble it, we've seen some details thanks to World of Guns in 3D, let's reassemble it so we can finally do the live fire test. So we can put this part of the gas system back in. We can reinsert the op rod. No, don't worry, not for now. Here it is, the upper part. Now we can put the wood back on. The wood. Here we are. And here is the rifle's perforated sheet metal piece held by the band.
A bit tight.
Here we have reassembled the gas system like this. Now comes the hard part. Let's assemble the bolt carrier. Once the bolt and bolt carrier are put back together, we can go ahead and place them on their guides. Here it slides quite efficiently. And now I'm already getting anxious because I'll have to fight against these springs. Here, hold the rifle for me if you can. Just to make our lives more complicated, we have more than one spring and more than one spring guide. Because screw all of you, as the Soviets would say, by the way. Now we're going to set it aside in here, but I don't know, you can't see it right now, but I'm trying to guide it into the hole here without it popping out. Everything went flying. Here it is. Let's set it down here. And now comes the hard part, because I'll have to push the spring inside, leave it here in the top cover, and pull everything back. Good luck. What? Good luck. I managed to do it once. I hope I can do it again. This is the practice of cursing that you didn't see on camera earlier, to try to fix and adjust this weapon to make it cycle properly. And speaking of cycling properly, let's go test it. And here we are again at the Sir Spessa range, where we're testing this wonderful SVT-40. We have our magazine and we can insert it into the weapon, just like with a Kalashnikov, front first and then the back, as you do with many other weapons. Besides, I almost feel like grabbing the handle with my left hand at this point, but we're more traditional. Come on, given the agility of the weapon, let's try a few shots. And as you can see, once the magazine is empty, the weapon stays in hold open. It's very interesting. In this video, you've heard and will continue to hear a lot of comparisons with the M1 Garand. I tend to compare it with the Garand simply because we're in the same historical period, in the same conflict, and the SVT-40 should be compared with the other semi-automatic rifles of that era. The second reason is that many of you are familiar with the Garand due to your military service, so the comparisons are useful in this case. So, regarding ergonomics and balance, the balance is that it's a weapon that's very front heavy. You can see how far forward the magazine is, but if you consider that it's here, the rest of the weapon is up there in front. Basically, the center of gravity is more or less here. It's quite far forward from this point of view, more forward than some rifles I've dealt with. Nevertheless, the lines and the wood are quite slim and fit well in the hand and on the shoulder. I mean, I repeat, you have to pay a lot of attention to this hand, which, almost by necessity, is further forward than I would like. I would almost prefer, especially if I need to shoot more accurately, to hold it closer to the magazine to shift the weight onto the elbow, so from this point of view. So, in terms of ergonomics, yes, but weight distribution a bit less. I really like that it has the magazine. It's a nice thing, something that we, especially modern shooters, are absolutely used to. The trigger is a little bit stiff. It's not the best trigger, but I would say it's a typical military trigger. That's it. It has to be stiff enough so that an army of farmers doesn't pull the trigger by accident just because they're stressed. Well, there are plenty of good reasons to have a slightly stiffer trigger for these uses. I really like the recoil feel because the gas system, the short stroke piston with less moving mass, kicks less. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just physics. Long stroke piston systems are very reliable and simple. It's a big piece. There's all the inertia of that part that cycles the weapon, but you can feel all the inertia of that part, all the weight of that part. Here, with very few moving parts, there's a quick and sharp hit. From this point of view, it's even more manageable than the Garand or, for that matter, the Mosin. Also because the gas system takes away some of the recoil energy, so it shoots very well. If I have to make another small criticism, I'm not crazy about these sights. The front sight is under these protective wings very much in Soviet style, adjustable from above, but it's very thin. And both the front sight and this protective part, I can see how it could easily get damaged if you bump it somewhere. And the rear sight is very reminiscent of those on Mosin rifles. Now, I'm not a big fan of the sights on the Russian Soviet Mosin. It's not very quick when it comes to target acquisition. I mean, you bring it up and you have these small sights that you have to look for a moment. The nice thing, for example, is the aperture sight, like the one on the Garand. You look through the hole, you've probably found the front sight, and you shoot where you see the front sight. Let's reload and try again. Now a bit more like an AK. The trigger was so stiff that for a moment I thought, it had a malfunction. It's not the best trigger, but we've already said that. As always, with an empty magazine, the weapon locks open. The SVT, despite being extremely iconic, immortalized both in movies and video games, actually had a very short service life. After the invasion, when they stopped production, they went back to the Mosin. They cost less, we've talked about it. The weapon itself has many little things that could be improved. In this sense, it's a first-generation self-loading rifle. However, the greatest legacy of the SVT is its gas system. Because it's the gas system that, as we've seen, is the father of all short-stroke piston systems. Even though at the same time in the United States for the M1 carbine, a short-stroke system was also invented. How it's made and built, if you take any AR-18 derivatives, simply maybe some guy watching us takes the ARX and disassembles the gas system, he'll notice that it's surprisingly similar. Because the SVT has this great merit of introducing and defining what a short-stroke piston should be in a long gun. Thanks for watching. As always, you make these videos possible. You, like the owner of this weapon who came here today to Spessa just to let me film it, if you have interesting pieces, please write to me. My contact info is in the description. If you'd like to help the channel, buy the t-shirts or subscribe. It helps with things like simply paying for this field. Unfortunately, companies like Facebook and YouTube don't pay firearms content creators very much. They don't like them at all. So I'm also asking you to help me out with a nice a comment, and by subscribing. Unfortunately, the people in charge of these companies, besides being reptilians, don't particularly like firearm content. It's tough. It's hard to make this kind of content and bring it to you online. There's nothing wrong with it, but some very powerful folks don't like it. That's all from me. And as always, I'll see you next time.